Welcome to Nordic Fairy Tales. If you enjoy dark stories and folklore, please click subscribe. It really means a lot to us. And if you have a suggestion for our next tale, we'd love to hear it in the comments. Now, shall we start? Chapter 1. The Burning. The year was 1734, in the deep winter heart of Gudbrandsdalen. Snow lay heavy on the rooftops, yet the air reeked not of frost, but of smoke, thick, choking, and acrid. They dragged Maren through the narrow main street, her wrists bound with rough rope that had bitten into her skin until it bled. The crowd pressed close, their breath fogging in the cold air, their faces twisted with a mixture of fear and hatred. The church bell tolled, slow and heavy, each strike echoing through the valley like a death knell. Maren's hair hung in wet, tangled clumps, crusted with snow and ice, yet her eyes, dark and unyielding, never left the faces of those who walked beside her. She mouthed their names one by one, as if committing them to memory. By the time they reached the stake, the sky was bruised with the deep purple of late afternoon, though the sun had never truly risen that day. The pyre beneath her feet was stacked high with dry birch and spruce, its scent sweet and sharp beneath the cold. The Soren scriver read aloud the charges: witchcraft, heresy, consorting with the devil, while the wind hissed through the valley. Children clung to their mothers, though some peeked out, wide-eyed, to watch. When the torch was brought forward, Maren's voice rang out, clear and cold as the winter air. On the day you lit the fire shall return. 10 winters from now, you and your blood will burn as I burn. Her words seemed to ripple through the crowd, the wind carrying them to the furthest corners of the gathered. The torch touched the birch logs. The flames spread fast, hungrily licking at her skirts. At first came the snapping of dry wood, then the shrill, unholy sound of screaming, not just from Maren, but from the air itself. Smoke billowed upward in black and red plumes, carrying the scent of charred flesh over the valley. Some swore they saw her eyes glowing like embers through the smoke, even as the skin peeled from her face. When the fire died down, nothing remained but ash, scorched rope, and a faint, lingering stench that would not be washed away. The crowd left in silence, save for the hiss of snowflakes settling on the blackened ground. But one man, the old woodcutter, stayed behind, staring at the stake, and he swore, though none would believe him, that as the wind shifted the ashes formed shapes of small bare footprints, glowing faintly before the snow covered them. Chapter 2. 10 Years of Silence. For a decade after the burning, the valley wore a strange, uneasy stillness, the kind that sinks into the bones. The pyre had long been dismantled, the charred ground buried under layers of snow and seasons, but the memory of Maren's final curse lingered like the smell of smoke on old clothes. The elders still spoke of her, but only in whispers, and only when the nights were long and the doors bolted tight. They remembered the way she had stared at them from the stake, naming them without sound, as though she'd been writing their fate into the very air. Most of the younger folk claimed to have forgotten. Children grew up hearing vague warnings not to linger alone after dark, but they were told it was the wolves, not the witch, they should fear. And yet, every spring, on the exact date of her burning, something strange would happen. The wind would rise without warning and carry with it a dry, bitter smell, the unmistakable scent of burnt flesh. The first time it happened, the villagers gathered to pray, locking their doors and dousing their fires as if trying to hide from the air itself. But as years passed and nothing happened, They told themselves it was only the thaw stirring up ash from old hearths. Still, some swore they saw it, ash drifting in the air, even when the ground was wet with snowmelt. Black flecks that would catch in your hair and cling to your clothes until you brushed them off, though they left faint grey smears on your skin. The widowed midwife who had once testified against Maren claimed that on certain nights she heard footsteps on her roof, light as a child's, and the sound of something scratching at the chimney stones. She told this to her sister one winter, and the sister swore never to sleep in her house again. In the 10th year after Maren's death, the date of her burning fell on a night of heavy snow. The flakes came thick and fast, smothering the fields and burying the paths in silence. The wind rattled the shutters, and in the oldest houses the small iron stoves glowed with heat as families huddled close. It was then that the first death came. Old Hans the miller was found in his bed the next morning, his body stiff, his skin mottled and blackened as though he had burned from within. His mouth was frozen in a grimace, lips cracked, teeth bared. There had been no fire in his house that night, no lamp left burning, but the smell filled every corner of his small home, thick and clinging. When they carried his body to the church, someone noticed the prints in the snow outside his door. Small bare footprints, each one glowing faintly red, leading away from the house and into the forest. No one followed them. Chapter 3. The First Death. The morning they found the miller was the morning Gudbrandsdalen truly began to remember. The snow had stopped falling just before dawn, leaving the world unnaturally still, as though sound itself had frozen. The men who went to fetch Hans found his door wide open, its hinges creaking softly in the wind. Inside, the air was heavy and suffocating, the stench of burned meat so overpowering that two of them had to stagger back outside, retching into the snow. Hans lay in his bed, the wool blanket pulled up to his chest. At first glance it looked as if he had simply died in his sleep, but then they saw the skin, blackened in places, cracked open like charred wood. His hands were curled tight, the nails broken as if he had clawed at the sheets in his final moments. The strangest thing was the frost. The walls, the floor, even the inside of the windows were lined with a thin, glittering layer of ice, though the small iron stove was still warm, and there, just above the headboard, was a smear of ash, not scattered, but in the perfect outline of a handprint, the fingers long and thin. Word spread fast. By midday, half the village had crowded outside Hans' house, whispering to one another. Some crossed themselves, others spat over their shoulders, muttering about evil spirits. It was the widow Ingrid, bent with age but sharp-eyed as ever, who spoke the words no one wanted to hear. She's come back. Maren, I told you the ash would walk again. The children didn't understand, but they understood enough to be afraid. It was Ole, the younger son of the blacksmith, who found the footprints in the snow behind the house. They were small, too small for any man, too perfect to be animal tracks, and they glowed faintly red, as though embers had been pressed into the snow. They led straight into the forest, vanishing into the black tangle of spruce and pine. That night, the wind rose again, rattling shutters and moaning through the gaps in the walls. In several homes, families heard the soft sound of ash falling from the rafters. One woman swore she woke to find a fine grey dust covering her baby's cradle, though the child slept peacefully. Another man claimed he heard breathing outside his window, slow, deliberate, and when he looked, there was nothing but darkness, and a single glowing footprint right there in the snow. The old fear was awake again, and it would not sleep. Chapter 4. The List. The church was dim that morning, the only light coming from the tall, narrow windows where the pale winter sun barely broke through the frost. Pastor Eric knelt by the altar, his breath misting in the frigid air. The smell of smoke from Hans' house still clung to his cassock. He had been unable to sleep since the miller's death. The image of that perfect blackened handprint above the bed would not leave him. Neither would the memory of Maren's final words, which he had been too young to hear in person, but had heard retold by every elder in the valley. 10 winters from now, you and your blood will burn as I burn. When the church bell struck noon, Eric descended into the archives beneath the altar. It was here, among mouldering paper and rotting leather bindings, that he found them, the trial records. They were brittle, the ink faded, but the names were still legible. There were 23 in total. Men and women who had testified against Maren, signed the orders, or lit the pyre themselves. Eric's hands trembled as he traced the list. He had buried 8 of them in the last decade, some from illness, some from accidents, but Hans' death was different. It matched too perfectly the description of Maren's own burning. The list was a death sentence, and he knew it. And the next name was Torbjörn, the lensmann's eldest son. Eirik tried to speak to Torbjörn's father, but the man refused to listen. "You speak like an old crone," he barked, slamming the door in the pastor's face. "Hans died from the cold, nothing more." That night, Eric could not rest. He sat by his window, staring out into the white void of the snowfield. The moon was hidden behind clouds, and the forest was a jagged shadow on the horizon. It was then he noticed movement. Something was crossing the snow. Not a person, not an animal, but a shifting trail of faint red light. Footprints, small, bare. They moved steadily toward the lensmann's house. Eric felt his breath catch in his throat. The wind carried with it a thin drizzle of ash, so fine it seemed to seep through the very walls, and somewhere out in the darkness, faint and far away, came the smell, that dry, heavy stink of charred flesh. By the time he lit his lantern and stepped outside, the footprints were gone, already half buried by drifting snow. But the lensmann's hound was howling, and the sound didn't stop until morning. Chapter 5. The Night Watch. By the 3rd day after Hans' death, the whole village knew Torbjörn's name was next. Some claimed they could see it in his eyes, the restlessness, the twitch at every sound, as though he could feel Maren's gaze on him already. The lensmann, stubborn as a rock, finally relented to the idea of a watch, not because he believed in the curse, but because he wanted to silence the whispers. That night 7 men gathered in Torbjörn's house. They barred the doors, sealed the shutters with strips of wet cloth to keep out the wind, and stoked the fire until the iron stove glowed orange. Each man carried an axe or a hunting spear. Torbjörn sat by the table, staring into his mug of ale, barely speaking. The only sound was the crack and hiss of burning wood. Hours passed. Snow tapped softly against the shutters. The wind whistled faintly in the chimney. One man began to doze in his chair. Then the stove went out, not slowly as a fire dies, but all at once, as though the heat had been ripped away. The men looked at each other, confused. Their breath puffed out in pale clouds. The air had turned frigid in seconds. That was when the ash began to fall. It drifted from the ceiling beams, fine and grey, coating the table, their shoulders, the floor. One of the men brushed it from his sleeve, and hissed, jerking back. "Hot," he whispered. The ash was warm. From somewhere inside the house came a faint crackle, like twigs catching fire. Then another sound, soft wet footsteps on the floorboards upstairs. "Who's up there?" the lensman barked, but his voice cracked halfway. They climbed the narrow stairs, their lanterns trembling in their hands. The hallway was lined with the ash, as though snow had fallen indoors. And at the far end stood a figure. She was small, her head bowed, hair hanging in matted ropes. Her skin was the colour of cinders, split in places to reveal glowing embers beneath. When she raised her face, her eyes were twin sparks in the dark. The men froze. "Maren," Torbjörn whispered. She smiled, a slow, terrible thing, and took one step forward. The boards under her bare feet smouldered. The lantern nearest her flickered and went out. In that heartbeat of darkness, the air roared with heat, and someone screamed. When the light flared again, Torbjörn was gone. Only a heap of blackened cloth remained where he had stood, and a trail of faintly glowing footprints led back down the stairs and vanished into nothing. Chapter 6. The Last Descendant. By morning, no one in Gudbrandsdalen dared to speak above a whisper. Torbjörn's death had shattered the thin crust of safety the lensman had tried to build. The 7 men who'd been in the house that night refused to speak of what they'd seen. 2 packed their belongings before sunrise and left the valley altogether. Pastor Erik was the only one still willing to act. He carried the list of Maren's accusers like a curse in his pocket, and now only one name remained, the final descendant. Kari, daughter of Ingeborg, granddaughter of the judge who had read Maren's death sentence aloud. She was only 19, newly married, and had given birth to her first child 3 weeks ago. Erik found her in her small wooden home, pale and exhausted. The baby swaddled in her arms. She'd heard the rumours but shook her head at them. "Maren has taken enough blood," she said with a fragile smile. "She will not take a mother and her newborn." Erik could not bring himself to answer. He had read the court transcripts. He knew what Maren had said to the judge before she was led to the stake. "Your blood will burn in your arms." When the wind began to howl outside, the smell came first, thick, choking, unmistakable. Burned flesh, carried on the storm. Ash swirled in the air, though the shutters were closed tight. "We must leave," Erik urged. "Now, before the sun goes down." Kari, trembling now, wrapped the child in blankets while Erik stepped out to ready the horse. But in the snow the footprints were already there, small, bare, faintly glowing as though the earth beneath them still smouldered. They rode south, snow stinging their faces, the wind pushing against them like a wall, but the ash followed. It clung to their cloaks, their hair, the baby's blankets. When the church tower of the next village finally came into sight, its bells were ringing in panic. People shouted from their doorways, "Do not come here! Do not bring her here!" Then came the darkness, not night, but a thick swallowing black, denser than storm clouds, as though the sun itself had been strangled, and within it a faint red glow. Kari clutched the baby to her chest. Erik, his eyes locked on the shifting shadows, knew it was already too late. Chapter 7. The Return of the Ashes. The darkness pressed against them like a living thing, thick and suffocating. Snow vanished beneath their feet, replaced by a black ashen ground that seemed to shift and breathe. The horse reared in panic, its eyes wide and rolling, before tearing free from Erik's grip and bolting into the void. Kari stood frozen, the baby silent in her arms, too silent. The red glow ahead swelled, pulsing like the embers of a dying fire until it took shape. Maren emerged from the black. She was smaller than Eric remembered from the trial records, but the fire inside her made her seem enormous. Her skin was cracked charcoal, glowing along the fissures, her hair drifting like strands of smoke. When she spoke, her voice was the hiss of 1,000 burning logs. 10 winters, she whispered, and now you burn. The ash in the air thickened, pouring in through every gap in Kari's cloak clinging to the baby's face. Eric stepped forward, raising the crucifix from around his neck, his voice breaking as he prayed. The wind surged, and the crucifix blackened in his hands. Flames burst from his cassock, crawling up his arms and devouring him in seconds. His scream was short, cut off as his body collapsed into a heap of glowing embers. Kari staggered back, holding her child tighter, but the footprints appeared behind her, small, bare, glowing, circling until she was trapped. Maren stepped closer, her ember eyes fixed on the swaddled bundle. One charred hand reached out, the heat rolling from her in waves. Kari's arms trembled violently, her breath coming in sobs. When Maren touched the blankets, the cloth ignited instantly, and the baby's cry pierced the darkness, once, twice, before being swallowed by the roar of fire. Kari's scream joined it, the two voices merging into one terrible rising wail before both were cut off. When the flames died, there was nothing left but ash drifting in the cold wind. The darkness receded, revealing the snow-covered valley again, silent and empty. The next morning, villagers found the church tower bells still swinging, though no one had rung them. In the snow outside the abandoned road into the forest, they found a trail of small glowing footprints leading into the trees and fading into nothing. Chapter 8. The Smell in the Wind. Years passed, and the story of Maren's return became something whispered over tankards in the tavern, or murmured by parents to frighten their children into obedience. The official record said nothing, no mention of Kari, no mention of the pastor's death. The lensman called it superstition and panic, and the surviving villagers nodded, but none dared live in Kari's home again. Time softened the edges of the tale, as it always does. The young came to believe it was just an old ghost story, meant to scare them away from the deep woods. But the elders knew better. Every year on the day of Maren's burning, the valley would change. The air would still, the snow would fall heavier, and the wind would carry something on it. Not the clean scent of winter, but the dry, sickly smell of burned flesh. Sometimes, if you stood outside and listened closely, you could hear the faint crackle of fire in the distance, and if the wind was strong enough, it would bring with it a dusting of ash. A few swore they had seen more than that. On dark evenings between the spruce trees, small glowing footprints in the snow, walking in pairs like those of a woman and a child, always leading deeper into the forest. Those who followed never came back, and so Gudbrandsdalen learned to keep its doors bolted on Maren's day, its fires doused, and its eyes turned away from the windows. For the curse had not died with her burning, it had only begun. Thank you for listening to this episode of Nordic Fairy Tales. If you liked the video, would you please consider subscribing, as it helps us with making more. Thank you, and have a good night.